Welcome friends to another sleepy history story. Tonight we're beginning the journey of the tale of the 47 Rōnin, one of Japan's most famous legends of loyalty and revenge. Before we drift into the snowy streets of Edo and the world of the samurai, I'd love for you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps me keep making these calm, boring history documentaries to relax with, whether you're falling asleep or just unwinding. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin with Chapter 1, Japan in the Age of the Samurai. Imagine Japan in the early 1700s, a land shaped like a dragon curling across the sea. The world was quieter then, no trains, no neon signs, no vending machines on every corner. Instead, villages dotted the countryside, wooden bridges stretched across streams, and great castles stood like stone giants watching over the land. This was Edo Japan, a time when the country was under the rule of the Tokugawa shogunate, and peace had lasted so long that people almost forgot what war looked like. But beneath that peace, honor, duty, and strict rules weighed heavily on everyone, especially the samurai. The Tokugawa shogunate was like the ultimate parent, strict, unbending, and with eyes everywhere. For over a century they had kept Japan stable by creating a system where everyone knew their place. Daimyos ruled their domains, farmers tilled their fields, merchants traded, and samurai stood as guardians of order. The shogun sat at the top like the chess master moving all the pieces. It was peaceful, yes, but also suffocating. Imagine living in a world where breaking the smallest rule could mean disgrace, or worse, your life. Society was a ladder, and every rung mattered. At the very bottom were the outcasts, those who handled death, leather, or other unclean tasks. Above them were the farmers, who fed the nation, then artisans, and then merchants, who strangely enough, though wealthy, were looked down upon because they didn't make anything, just sold stuff. At the top stood the samurai, proud warriors who once lived by the sword but now mostly lived by paperwork and etiquette. They were like lions in a zoo, still dangerous but trapped in a cage of rules. The samurai lived by Bushidō, the way of the warrior. It was more than just fighting, it was loyalty, discipline, and self-control. A samurai had to be brave, polite, and wise. He was supposed to be the perfect blend of scholar and soldier, someone who could recite poetry before cutting an enemy in half. But here's the twist. By the 1700s, Japan was so peaceful that many samurai didn't have wars to fight anymore. Instead, they studied calligraphy, tea ceremonies, and martial arts drills that rarely left the dojo. It was a strange balance. Fierce warriors with too much free time. The shogunate controlled every detail of life. Daimyo lords had to spend every other year in Edo, a system called sunken kotai, where their families stayed in the capital almost like hostages. This kept the lords loyal, because nobody wanted to risk the shogun's wrath. Roads were carefully patrolled, villages were counted and taxed, and even hairstyles were regulated. Yes, even your haircut could reveal your social status. Imagine being born into a role you could never escape, your fate decided the moment you took your first breath. But don't think of this era as gloomy, it was also colorful. Edo, the capital, buzzed with theaters, kabuki plays, tea houses, and markets selling everything from silk to fresh fish. Lanterns glowed at night, and storytellers entertained crowds with tales of ghosts, heroes, and mischievous fox spirits. Beneath the stern face of the shogunate, everyday life could be lively, even joyful. And it was in this vibrant yet disciplined world that our tale of loyalty and revenge was about to unfold. Yet, for the samurai, honor remained everything. It was like invisible armor, stronger than steel. To lose it was worse than death, and if a samurai's lord was disgraced, the shame carried down to his retainers like a heavy chain. The people of Edo whispered stories of loyal warriors, but none knew that soon they would witness the greatest tale of samurai loyalty ever told. In the calm of Edo's quiet streets, destiny was waiting, sharpening its blade. The 1700s might have been peaceful, but the peace was like a teapot left on the stove too long, calm on the surface, boiling underneath. The samurai class was restless, and the system was fragile. One insult, one act of arrogance could shatter the delicate balance. And that is exactly what was about to happen. But for now the stage is set, a country wrapped in order, a people bound by honor, and warriors still searching for a purpose. Think of this as the calm before the storm. The tale of the 47 Rōnin doesn't begin with swords clashing. It begins in this world of rules and rituals, a world where a samurai's loyalty to his master was as natural as breathing, and when that bond was broken, it wasn't just personal, it was cosmic. It threatened the very balance of society. Our story will show how far men will go to defend honor, even when the cost is everything. So as you lie back and get comfortable, picture yourself walking through Edo, Japan. Hear the crunch of wooden sandals on stone streets, smell incense drifting from temples, and see samurai with calm faces and sharp swords. Everything is in order, everything is peaceful, but history has a way of slipping surprises into quiet moments. And soon, one incident inside Edo Castle will set in motion the most famous story of loyalty and revenge the world has ever known. Now that we've set the stage of Edo Japan, it's time to meet one of our main characters, Lord Asano Naganori. He wasn't the most powerful daimyo in Japan, nor the richest. In fact, compared to some lords with massive domains, Asano's Arko territory was modest. But what he lacked in size, he made up for in reputation. People knew him as a fair leader, a man with dignity, and someone who cared about doing things properly. In short, he was the kind of boss you wouldn't mind working for, unless of course you had a habit of cutting corners. Asano was born in 1667 and came from a samurai lineage that valued loyalty and service. By his early 30s, he held responsibility as the daimyo of Arko, a domain along the coast of Harima province. Imagine running a small town, managing rice fields, dealing with taxes, and making sure your people were fed, all while also keeping your honor spotless. That was his daily life. And unlike many other lords, Asano wasn't flashy. He was more of a do-the-job-right type. If he were alive today, he'd probably be the guy who actually reads the instruction manual before putting furniture together. Life as a daimyo wasn't all sipping tea and strolling in gardens. The Tokugawa shogunate demanded loyalty above everything. Every move a daimyo made was watched. Asano had to split his time between his home domain and Edo, where he was required to spend time serving the shogun directly. This wasn't optional, it was law. The shogun wanted to make sure the daimyos didn't get too comfortable back home plotting rebellions. For Asano, it meant long months in the capital, navigating court politics and bowing in all the right ways at the right times. By all accounts, Asano was a serious man, not humorless but very focused on doing things properly. If the shogunate told him to host envoys from the imperial court, he wanted to do it perfectly. He valued order, respect, and tradition. Some might call it rigid, but for a samurai lord, that was exactly what people expected. Still, you can picture him as the kind of guy who got quietly irritated when people broke rules. You know, the type who would give you that look if you chewed too loudly during dinner. Despite his seriousness, Asano wasn't feared as a tyrant. He was respected. His retainers trusted him. For samurai, loyalty was easier to give when your lord treated you with fairness, and Asano had that quality. His men admired him not because he was the strongest warrior, but because he was honorable. And that's the thing about honor. It's contagious. When a leader has it, his followers will guard it with their lives. This connection between Asano and his retainers would soon be tested in ways none of them could have imagined. Now, it's worth pointing out that Asano wasn't perfect. Some records describe him as inexperienced in the finer points of court life. He wasn't raised among the slick-tongued politicians of A's. He knew the way of the warrior, not necessarily the way of endless bowing and gift-giving that greased the wheels of high society. This would matter later, because Azo's political scene was less about swords and more about subtle insults, expectations and favors. And let's be honest, subtle insults are sometimes harder to handle than swords. The shogunate placed a lot of trust in Asano in 1701. He was chosen along with another daimyo to host envoys from the imperial court in Kyoto. This was a big deal. Hosting envoys wasn't just throwing a dinner party. It was about representing the shogunate's dignity. Every bow, every cushion arrangement, even the exact wording of greetings had to be flawless. Think of it as the ultimate performance review, except your boss was the shogun, and failing could ruin your entire family. And here's where the trouble began. To help Asano prepare, the shogunate assigned him a tutor in court etiquette. His name was Kira Yoshinaka, a senior official who was supposed to guide him through the intricate rituals. Sounds helpful, right? Unfortunately, Kira was not exactly a patient teacher. He was known for being arrogant, quick to take offense, and very fond of receiving gifts. Lots of gifts, the kind that made his teaching go a little smoother. Asano, being more straightforward, didn't play that game, and that friction was about to spark into something much bigger. At this point, Asano was still trying his best to carry out his duty with dignity. He had no idea that this seemingly routine assignment, hosting a few envoys, would lead to one of the most famous stories in Japanese history. Sometimes history doesn't come with drum rolls or flashing signs. It comes quietly, disguised as an ordinary job, and only later do people realize they were standing at the edge of destiny. That's exactly where Lord Asano stood in 1701, calm and unsuspecting, about to walk into a storm. So here's Lord Asano, a daimyo with a modest domain, a serious sense of duty, and a heart full of honor. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't corrupt, and he wasn't about to bend to arrogance. These traits made him admirable to his retainers but dangerous in the world of court politics. His life was about to take a turn that no one could have predicted, and though his role in this story will end swiftly, the loyalty he inspired would echo through history in the actions of 47 men who refused to let his honor die with him. Every good story needs a rival, and in the tale of the 47 Rōnin, that rival comes in the form of Kira Yoshinaka. If Lord Asano was known for dignity and seriousness, Kira was known for the opposite, arrogance, vanity, and a love of being treated like the most important man in the room. His job was no small matter. As a master of court ceremonies, he had the authority to instruct daimyos on the finer points of etiquette. Imagine a strict wedding planner who also has the power to ruin your career if your bow wasn't deep enough. That was Kira. Kira's position was prestigious. When imperial envoys came from Kyoto, it was his responsibility to make sure everything was perfect. The shogunate trusted him to maintain the dignity of Edo Castle. He was supposed to be the expert who smoothed over problems, but in practice, Kira had a reputation for being difficult. He expected gifts from the lords he instructed, fine silks, precious coins, or expensive food. If he didn't get what he wanted, his helpfulness suddenly dried up. He wasn't above holding a grudge either. In short, Kira was the kind of guy who made sure everyone knew he was the smartest person in the room. Now the thing about Kira is that he thrived in the political jungle of Edo. He knew how to flatter the right people and belittle the rest. His tongue was sharper than a sword, and he knew how to cut with words. While Asano valued sincerity, Kira valued appearances. He measured respect in gifts and attention, not in loyalty or honesty. This was bound to clash with someone like Lord Asano, who simply wasn't interested in playing that kind of game. When the shogunate assigned Kira to train Asano for the imperial envoy reception, the trouble started almost immediately. Kira expected gifts, the kind of offerings that showed respect. Asano, being straightforward, gave only modest tokens. Nothing lavish. Kira took this as an insult. In his mind, Asano wasn't honoring him properly. And if there's one thing an arrogant official hates, it's the feeling of being unappreciated. Kira began mocking Asano in public. He insulted his manners, criticized his preparation, and humiliated him in front of others. For Asano, this was unbearable. Honor wasn't just about personal pride. It reflected on his entire domain. Every sharp word from Kira felt like a slap, not only to him but to the samurai of Ako who looked to him for leadership. Still, Asano tried to endure it. That was Bushidō. Patience, discipline, control. But everyone has a breaking point, and Kira seemed determined to find Asano's. Now, you have to understand, insults hit differently in Edo Japan. This wasn't just playground name-calling. This was an attack on a man's honor, his family, and his entire province. To a samurai, words like these could sting more than a blade, and the more Kira pushed, the more he backed Asano into a corner. But let's be clear, Kira wasn't all bluster. He was clever. He knew exactly how far he could push without crossing the shogunate himself. He wielded etiquette like a weapon, hiding behind rules and rituals. If anyone dared challenge him, he could twist the story to make them look like the aggressor. That's what made him dangerous. He wasn't stronger than Asano. He didn't have more men. What he had was the power of politics, and the confidence to wield it ruthlessly. Of course, people whispered about Kira's arrogance. Some respected him, sure, but many disliked him. His greed and sharp tongue made enemies, though most dared not say so aloud. Yet, in the world of Edo politics, arrogance could survive as long as you had the right connections, and Kira had them. It's one of history's ironies that the man who would trigger one of the most famous tales of loyalty and vengeance didn't win fame for courage or wisdom, he won it for being petty. If Asano was like a steady flame, Kira was like smoke, slippery, irritating, and hard to pin down. He thrived on making others uncomfortable, and he believed that his position gave him the right to demand whatever he pleased. But what he didn't understand, or maybe what he underestimated, was that some men value honor above life itself. And when you keep poking at someone like that, eventually, something has to snap. So here we have the perfect storm: Asano, the dignified but rigid daimyo, and Kira, the arrogant official who loved to be bribed. Two men forced to work together in Edo Castle under the watchful eyes of the shogun, neither one willing to bend. One valued honor, the other valued pride. The stage was set, and all it needed was a spark. That spark would come soon, and when it did, it would change the lives of 47 men forever. Edo Castle was more than just a fortress. It was the beating heart of Tokugawa power. Imagine endless corridors lined with polished wooden floors, sliding paper doors that opened into chambers glowing with lantern light, and samurai guards standing as still as statues. It was beautiful, yes, but also suffocating. Inside those walls, every bow mattered, every word carried weight, and one wrong move could end a career or a life. For Lord Asano and Kira Yoshinaka, this was the stage where their simmering feud would begin to boil. To the casual eye, life in the castle seemed orderly. Daimyos walked the halls in their finest robes. Officials carried scrolls, and the smell of incense drifted from audience chambers. But beneath the calm surface, there was an undercurrent of tension. Rivalries festered behind polite smiles, and words could be as sharp as any blade. Kira had already decided that Asano's lack of lavish gifts was a personal insult. and so he began his campaign of humiliation. Kira found subtle ways to insult Asano. He mocked his speech, laughed at his mistakes, and gave deliberately vague instructions for ceremonies. If Asano misstepped, Kira was ready to point it out loudly enough for others to hear. It was like being trapped in school with the meanest teacher imaginable, except this teacher could ruin your entire legacy. And the more Kira mocked, the more the whispers spread. Asano's dignity was being chipped away, piece by piece. Asano tried to endure. Bushidō demanded patience, after all. A samurai was expected to keep his emotions in check, to remain calm even in the face of insult. But the castle wasn't a battlefield where swords clashed. It was a battlefield of pride. Every word from Kira was like salt poured into an open wound. And Asano, though disciplined, was still human. His honor wasn't just his own. It was the honor of his entire domain, of his ancestors, and of the men who served him. One of the cruelest things about Edo Castle was how public everything was. A mistake wasn't just private, it was witnessed by dozens of other lords and officials. When Kira insulted Asano, others watched, and though many sympathized silently, none dared intervene. This only deepened Asano's humiliation. Imagine the sting of being laughed at in front of your peers, knowing you couldn't respond without risking disgrace. It was a test of patience, but patience has limits. One can't all. The more Kira pressed, the more cracks appeared in Asano's composure. Perhaps Kira saw this as a game, testing how far he could push before the proud lord broke. But for Asano, this wasn't a game. Each insult weighed on him like stones in his sleeves. He was a man of honor, raised to protect dignity above all else. And every day in Edo Castle felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, with Kira shoving him closer and closer to the drop. The irony of it all was that this tension built during preparations for an event, meant to symbolize harmony, the reception of envoys from the imperial court. While Edo Castle polished itself for a flawless show of respect, inside its walls a storm was brewing. It was as if the shogunate had built a perfect stage set, only to have the actors backstage throwing insults at one another. The audience, the imperial envoys, would never see the cracks, but the samurai within those walls felt them deeply. Day by day the insults continued. Some accounts even suggest that Kira deliberately gave Asano incorrect instructions, then mocked him when he made mistakes. It was a cruel setup, designed to humiliate. The castle was meant to be a place of order and discipline, but here it had become a pressure cooker. And when you mix honor, humiliation and arrogance in the same chamber, you don't need a prophet to guess what's coming next. For the samurai of Asako, watching their lord endure this was painful. They were sworn to defend his honor, but in the castle they couldn't draw swords. All they could do was grit their teeth and bow, as their master bore the weight of insult. It must have burned inside them, an anger that could not yet be released. They didn't know it, but these small humiliations were writing the first lines of the story that would define their loyalty forever. So here we are in the heart of Edo Castle, one man who would not be bribed, and another who would not forgive being snubbed. The walls echoed with whispered insults, the corridors grew heavy with tension, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with the clash of pride. Everyone knew that something had to give, and soon, in a moment as swift as a sword strike, the tension would snap, and history would never forget what followed. Every story has that one moment where patience runs out. For Lord Asano, it happened on a spring morning in Edo Castle, 1701. The halls were quiet, lanterns glowing softly, and officials were busy preparing for the reception of imperial envoys. Everything was supposed to be dignified, orderly, flawless, but beneath the polished floors and golden screens, tension between Asano and Kira had reached its breaking point. The insults had piled up like snow on a roof, and at last the roof was ready to collapse. Accounts differ on what Kira said that day, but all agree it was cruel. Some say he mocked Asano's lack of refinement, others that he hurled insults at his home province of Ako. Whatever the exact words, they were designed to wound deeply, and this time they struck home. Imagine years of self-control crumbling in an instant, the final straw snapping. Asano's face, normally calm, twisted with fury. The patience of a samurai, tested to its limit, had finally broken. In one swift motion, Asano drew his short sword. The sound of steel leaving its scabbard rang out in the castle corridor, echoing like thunder in a temple. Guards and attendants froze, eyes wide. This was no ordinary gesture. Drawing a weapon inside Edo Castle was forbidden, one of the gravest offenses imaginable. But in that moment, Asano wasn't thinking of rules. He was thinking of honor, of insults too deep to bear, of loyalty to the dignity he had sworn to protect. Asano slashed at Kira. The blade cut across his face, leaving blood but not death. Kira stumbled back, clutching the wound, his proud arrogance replaced by fear. In that instant, the balance of power flipped. Asano the victim became Asano the attacker, and Kira the Tormentor became Kira the Wounded. But it was no victory. Asano hadn't killed him, and that failure would shape everything that followed. The castle erupted into chaos. Guards rushed forward, attendants screamed, and whispers shot through the halls like wildfire. A sword had been drawn inside Edo Castle, a sacred space where violence was unthinkable. It didn't matter why or how long Kira had provoked him. The act itself was enough to seal Asano's fate. In that moment, his honor was defended, but his life as a daimyo was over. Kira survived, but he was shaken. Blood on his face was more than just a wound. It was proof that he had been attacked in the very heart of the shogun's castle. Officials hurried to tend to him while others restrained Asano. For the watching daimyos, the lesson was clear. If even one lord could lose his composure here, then nobody was safe. The act was shocking not only for its violence, but because it broke the sacred rules that held the shogunate's authority together. Asano didn't fight the guards. Once the moment of fury had passed, he calmed himself, as though he understood the gravity of what he had done. He knew there would be no forgiveness, but in his heart, he must have felt some grim satisfaction. He had finally struck back against the man who had insulted him relentlessly. For one heartbeat, he had defended his honor, blade against arrogance, and that heartbeat would echo across centuries. The corridors buzzed with whispers long after the blood was cleaned. Some lords secretly admired Asano for striking at Kira. Others shook their heads, knowing he had doomed himself. In Edo Castle, appearances were everything, and Asano's outburst had shattered the facade of order. The shogun could not ignore it. Punishment would be swift. But those whispers, those quiet stories traded between daimyos, would live on, fueling sympathy for the man who dared raise his sword. For Asano's retainers, news of the outburst was like a thunderclap. Their master, the man they had sworn loyalty to, had raised his sword in defense of honor, and now he was as good as dead. They couldn't stop what was coming, but in that moment, something deeper stirred in them. They saw not just disgrace, but a cause. And though they couldn't yet act, the seeds of loyalty and vengeance were planted in their hearts. And so the calm of Edo Castle shattered in one furious moment. Lord Asano, the dignified but patient daimyo, had finally reached his breaking point. His blade cut not only into Kira's face, but into the very fabric of Tokugawa order. From here there was no turning back. His punishment was certain, and his fate sealed. But his story was not over, because 47 men were watching, and their loyalty would transform this outburst into one of the most famous acts of vengeance in history. The shogunate wasted no time. In a world ruled by order and ceremony, an outburst like Asano's was more than just personal anger. It was rebellion against the dignity of Edo Castle itself. Word spread quickly through the chambers. Lord Asano had drawn his blade. The officials didn't ask why, or whether he had been provoked. They didn't weigh insults against actions. The simple fact was enough. Asano had broken the law, and in the Tokugawa system there was only one punishment fitting for a daimyo of his rank: seppuku. Seppuku was no ordinary execution. It was the samurai's way of dying with honor, a ritualized suicide that proved loyalty, discipline, and courage until the very end. To the outside world it seemed harsh, even cruel, but in Japan of the 1700s it was seen as noble, a way for a man to control his final act and leave the world with dignity. For Lord Asano, this meant his disgrace would be balanced, at least partly by the honor of dying like a true samurai. The shogun himself, Tokugawa Tsunayoshi, was informed of the attack. Known for his strict enforcement of order, Tsunayoshi didn't hesitate. To him, it didn't matter that Kira had provoked Asano, nor that Asano's anger was understandable. What mattered was the sacred rule of Edo Castle. If one man broke it and lived, others might dare the same. So the shogun gave his command. Lord Asano would die by seppuku, and his domain would be confiscated. It was swift, merciless, and final. Asano was taken to the residence of another daimyo, where the ritual would be performed. He was not allowed to return home, not even to say farewell to his family. His wife and children were left in Arko, unaware that they would soon lose everything. In the silence of that borrowed chamber, Asano prepared for the end, calm, dignified, without complaint. If his life had been ruled by Bushidō, then so too would his death. The ceremony was exact. A second, called a kaishakunin, was appointed to stand by with a long sword. His duty was to swiftly decapitate Asano after the ritual cut, sparing him prolonged suffering. This was not done in cruelty, but in mercy, an acknowledgement of the unbearable pain seppuku inflicted. Even in death, samurai followed ritual, balancing suffering with compassion. He wrote his death poem, as was the custom, a final expression of his spirit before the act. Death poems were often short, reflective, and tinged with acceptance. In those quiet moments, pen scratching across paper, Asano sealed his fate with words as well as with steel. His retainers would never forget those final lines, carried like an echo of his soul. Then came the moment itself. Dressed in white robes, Asano knelt before the ritual blade. The room was silent but for the faint crackle of candlelight. With steady hands, he grasped the sword, drew it across his abdomen, and began the final act of his life. Before the pain could overwhelm him, the Keishakunin stepped forward and struck, his blade flashing in the dim light. It was swift, it was merciful, it was done. Word spread quickly through Edo. Lord Asano was dead, his domain confiscated, his family cast down. His retainers were now Rōnin, masterless samurai, stripped of rank and purpose. For most, that would have been the end of the story. A disgraced lord, punished for breaking the rules, forgotten in the tide of history. But Asano's men were not ordinary followers. His death would not be the end, but the spark of something far greater. For those retainers, grief quickly hardened into resolve. They had watched their master humiliated, and then condemned, and though he died with dignity, the injustice of it burned within them. Kira lived, untouched except for a scar, while their master lay in the ground. To men raised in the way of Bushidō, this was unacceptable. Loyalty demanded balance. And so while Asano's life had ended, his story was only beginning. The sentence of seppuku closed one chapter of Asano's life, but it opened another in history. His death was the seed that would grow into legend, the tale of 47 Rōnin who chose to sacrifice everything to honor him. For now the castle corridors were quiet, the ink on the judgment scrolls had dried, and Edo had returned to its rigid order. But beneath that surface calm, the spirit of Lord Asano lived on, in the hearts of men who would soon shake the world with their loyalty. When Lord Asano's blade fell and his life ended, something else was born that very night. The loyalty of his retainers took on a new form. In an instant, over 300 samurai of Arko found themselves masterless. Their titles vanished, their stipends gone, and their future uncertain. In Japanese society, this was the worst fate for a warrior. To become Rōnin, wandering men without a lord, shadows of what they once were. But among them, 47 refused to let their loyalty die with Asano. Instead, they carried his honor like a living flame. The confiscation of Arko Castle came swiftly. Shogunate officials arrived to strip banners from the walls, seize records, and remove symbols of Asano's rule. The once proud fortress was left hollow, its retainers scattering into the world with little more than their swords and their grief. Families wept, servants packed what little they could carry, and the proud halls of Arko echoed with silence. For most, this was the end of the line, but for a core group of Asano's men, it was just the beginning. At the heart of these men was Orochi Kurinosuke, Asano's chief retainer. Calm, clever, and deeply loyal, Orochi became the center of gravity for the grieving samurai. While others despaired, he thought ahead. He knew that the system had treated Asano unfairly, punished swiftly, while Kira still lived comfortably in Edo, and though revenge would mean breaking the law, Bushidō whispered that loyalty mattered more than rules. So he began to gather men, not recklessly but carefully, one by one. To become Rōnin was not just to lose status, it was to live with shame. In the eyes of society, they were masterless, drifting, often despised. Townsfolk looked down on them, and samurai of other domains avoided them. But these men of Arko wore their shame differently. For them, every insult from the public only deepened their determination. They endured humiliation in life so that they could restore their master's honor in death. Or Duishi understood the risks. The shogunate had eyes everywhere. If they openly spoke of revenge, they would all be arrested and executed. So he counseled patience. They would wait, plan, and strike only when Kira least expected it. For now they had to scatter, blending into the world as ordinary men. Some became merchants, others craftsmen. A few even pretended to abandon their loyalty entirely. But behind the disguise, every one of them carried the same burning oath. The vow they swore was simple. They would avenge Lord Asano by killing Kira Yoshinaka. It wasn't about personal hatred, it was about balance. In the samurai worldview, the universe itself had been tilted by Kira's survival and Asano's death. Restoring order meant blood, to delay was agony, but to act too soon was suicide. So Oshi taught them to wait. For now, Kira watched them, expecting revenge. But as the months passed, his vigilance would fade. That was when the Rōnin would strike. Not all samurai chose to join. Some feared for their families, others doubted the plan. To plot against Kira was to plot against the shogunate itself, and failure meant death. Not only for themselves but disgrace for their loved ones. But the 47 who stayed were bound together, not by chance but by the deepest ties of loyalty. History remembers them because they chose to walk the hardest path. The transformation from retainers to Rōnin was both physical and spiritual. They shed the armor of daimyo service and stepped into a life of secrecy. Where once they walked proudly in Arko banners, now they wore plain robes. Where once they defended a castle, now they defended only an idea. their master's honor, and in that humility, their loyalty grew stronger. In silence and patience, the legend of the 47 Rōnin began to take shape. For Edo, life moved on. Markets bustled, theaters sang, and courtiers whispered of other scandals. But for these men, time itself seemed to pause. Each day of waiting was a sharpening of the blade. Each insult they endured in disguise was a spark added to the fire of vengeance. They were no longer bound by lands or titles, only by loyalty, and that loyalty turned their disgrace into purpose. And so, from the ashes of Arko's fall, the 47 Rōnin were born. They were men without a master, but with a mission greater than any lord could give. Their path was dangerous, uncertain, and marked for death, but in choosing loyalty above life, they carved their names into history. For now they scattered into the shadows, pretending to fade away, yet every step they took carried them closer to the night, when swords would flash, and justice, by their definition, would finally be served. After Lord Asano's death, Edo quickly settled back into routine. For most, the incident was just another scandal to whisper about before moving on. But for Oshi Kuronosuke and the loyal retainers of Arko, life would never be the same. They had sworn to avenge their master, and now came the hardest part, waiting. Revenge wasn't something they could rush. To succeed, they would have to be patient, clever, and as silent as falling snow. The first step was simple but painful: disappear. If they showed anger too soon, Kira would be ready. So the Rōnin scattered across Japan, blending into ordinary life. Some took jobs as merchants, selling sake or lumber. Others disguised themselves as farmers or tradesmen. Even Oshi, their leader, walked away from the life of a noble samurai, pretending to sink into shame. To outsiders it looked like the men of Arko had abandoned their honor, but in truth, they were sharpening it in secret. Oshi knew the shogunate would expect revenge. Kira certainly expected it too. His mansion bristled with guards, walls reinforced, gates locked tight. Spies were everywhere, watching the former Arko samurai, waiting for a slip. If they struck too early, they would be cut down before reaching him. The only way forward was patience. They had to convince the world, including Kira, that they had given up. Only then could vengeance bloom. To sell the disguise, Oshi did something bold. He moved to Kyoto and began living a life that shocked everyone. He drank heavily, stumbled through the streets, and visited tea houses night after night. People whispered that he had abandoned honor completely, that grief had broken him. Even his own family suffered shame. His wife eventually divorced him, unable to bear the disgrace. But Oshi endured it all, because every drunken laugh, every slurred word, was part of the plan. Kira's spies watched Oshi closely at first, but as the months passed, they reported back that the former chief retainer was nothing more than a broken man. If the leader of the Arko Rōnin had fallen so low, surely no revenge would come. Kira began to relax, letting his guard drop. His mansion, still fortified, wasn't watched with the same paranoia as before. The Rōnin's disguise of weakness was slowly becoming their greatest weapon. While Oshi played the fool in Kyoto, the other Rōnin lived in silence, training in secret. They sold goods by day, then gathered quietly at night, practicing sword drills in barns and hidden courtyards. Each man kept himself sharp, because they knew the moment would come suddenly, and when it did, hesitation would mean death. They prepared not only their blades but their hearts. To them, survival was not the goal, only justice. Years passed like this. The world thought the Arko samurai were finished, forgotten. Some mocked them as cowards, others pitied them as failures. But in reality, those years were the sharpening stone. Patience was their blade, and silence was their armor. Few stories in history have shown such discipline. Men willing to wait, to be disgraced, to be scorned, all for the sake of one night of vengeance. One night, a samurai loyal to Kira spotted him drunk and asleep in the street. Outraged at his disgrace, the man kicked him, spat on him, and called him worthless. Oishi didn't resist. He lay there in the mud, silent. To those watching, it seemed the last spark of honor had left him. But inside, his resolve only hardened. The insults he endured in life were fuel for the vengeance he carried in secret. At last, after nearly 2 years, the Rōnin were ready. They had mapped Kira's mansion, counted his guards, and gathered their weapons in secret. Oishi ended his drunken act and quietly traveled to Edo, reuniting with his men. For the first time since Asano's death, the 47 gathered together, their disguises cast aside. They were no longer wandering Rōnin, no longer merchants or drunkards. They were samurai again, and their swords waited for justice. The plan was set. On a winter night, when the city slept under a blanket of snow, they would strike Kira's mansion. 2 years of humiliation and patience would finally end in steel. Their master was gone, their lives already forfeit, but their honor was about to be restored. As they sharpened their blades and whispered their vows, the quiet of Edo trembled with the promise of vengeance. If loyalty is fire, then patience is the fuel that keeps it alive. For the Rōnin, patience meant hiding their purpose. And for Oshi Kuranosuke, their leader, it meant carrying the heaviest burden of all. He had to destroy his own reputation to protect their secret. History remembers his loyalty, but at the time many thought he had lost his way. It takes a rare kind of strength to let the world call you dishonorable, while your heart beats only for honor. After Asano's death, Oshi moved his family to Kyoto, but instead of living quietly, he began visiting tea houses, gambling and drinking heavily. Day after day he wandered the city in a haze of supposed disgrace. Neighbors whispered, courtiers sneered, and even his allies shook their heads. How could Asano's most loyal retainer fall so low, they asked. Yet every stagger and slurred word was a mask. Behind the drunken act he was sharpening the edge of their plan. It wasn't just strangers who suffered for Oshi's disguise. His own family paid the price. His wife, humiliated by the shame he brought to their name, eventually divorced him. His children endured whispers and ridicule. To the world it looked like a once proud samurai had abandoned everything for drink and pleasure. But to Oshi, every insult endured by his family was another step toward convincing Kira that the Rōnin were harmless. Kira's spies were everywhere, and they reported everything back to their master. At first they were suspicious, but the more they watched Oshi, the more convinced they became. He is finished, they told Kira. There will be no revenge. Kira began to relax. His guards remained, but their vigilance dulled. The net that had once surrounded him slowly loosened, strand by strand, as he believed his enemies had crumbled. The disguise became so convincing that even strangers mocked him. One night, as Oshi lay drunk in the street, a passing samurai grew furious at the sight. Here was a man who had once served a daimyo, now groveling in filth. The stranger kicked him, spat on him, and called him a disgrace to Bushidō. Oshi didn't resist. He didn't even lift his head. He let the shame wash over him like rain. To the world, he was a coward. To himself, he was a blade hiding in its sheath. This was the genius of Oshi's plan. By sacrificing his reputation, he created the perfect cover. The Rōnin's greatest strength was now invisibility. They were forgotten, dismissed, even pitied. Nobody expected them to rise again. And in that silence, in that humiliation, they gained the only advantage that mattered: surprise. The months dragged into years. For the Rōnin, it was agony. To wait, to pretend, to watch their leader stumble through the streets. It must have tested their faith daily. Some likely doubted. Some may have wondered if Oshi's had truly lost his way. But in the end, the mask never slipped. Beneath the disguise, Oshi's loyalty burned steady. He carried the shame so that his brothers could carry their swords into Kira's mansion one day. And then, when the time was right, Oshi's ended the act. One night, he left Kyoto quietly, no longer stumbling, no longer drunk. He traveled to Edo, straight-backed and sober, his disguise discarded. For the first time in years, he stood before his men as the samurai he had always been. In their eyes, the disgrace melted away, replaced by respect deeper than ever before. Their leader had carried shame for them all, and now he carried the sword once more. When the 47 gathered again, they were not the broken men Kira imagined. They were sharp, disciplined, and ready. Their disguises had been cast aside, and their purpose renewed. Oshi's years of sacrifice had bought them the one thing no sword could cut: time. And with that time they had forged a plan so patient, so precise, that nothing could stop it now. History often praises men who fight openly, boldly, and without fear. But Oshi's greatness came from the opposite, from patience, from silence, from the willingness to be called a coward so that his men could strike like lions. His sacrifice of reputation was not weakness, it was strength in its most painful form. And because of it, the Rōnin's path to vengeance lay wide open. Soon the winter night of destiny would arrive. Waiting is its own kind of battle. For the 47, the sword drills were the easy part. The hard part was silence. A whole year stretched out like a snowy road at night, quiet and cold. Each man learned to live a double life, polite to neighbors, humble at work, invisible in crowds, while inside his mind rehearsed the same movements again and again. How to run, where to turn, which gate to take, which voice to follow in the dark. The plan lived in their bones now, not just their heads. And with every sunrise, the edges of that plan grew sharper. They trained quietly, behind shutters, in barns, in courtyards with walls high enough to swallow the sound of wooden swords. No shouting, no bravado, just breath and rhythm. A partner's step, the whisper of bamboo striking bamboo, and the soft thud of sandals pivoting on tatami. To keep up appearances, they practiced carpentry, sold sake, stitched clothing, carried crates. But when night slid over the rooftops, they gathered in twos and threes to polish blades and repeat combinations until muscle remembered what the mind dared not say aloud. Maps became scripture. One man counted roof tiles from a tea-house window. Another measured alley lengths by the number of steps between lantern posts. They noted guard shifts by the creak of a gate and the smell of ash as braziers were changed. A delivery boy watched which doors received rice and which doors never opened. A vendor learned which dogs barked at strangers and which slept through everything. Piece by silent piece, Kira's mansion stopped being a mystery and became a blueprint they could walk in their sleep. Winter was their ally. Snow hushes the world and betrays the careless. They studied how ice formed on eaves, how footsteps sounded on packed drifts, how breath steamed and disappeared. A blizzard would be too loud, guards stay inside. Then, a crisp, gentle snowfall was perfect, soft enough to muffle, light enough to see. They tested straw sandals for grip, wrapped cloth around scabbards, and learned to move like shadows, the kind that choose where to fall. Tools came together slowly. Ladders built in sections to carry under cloaks, ropes coiled inside rice sacks, grapnels disguised as iron fittings for shop doors. A carpenter Rōnin crafted wedges that could jam sliding gates without splintering them. Another forged small chisels to pry shutters quietly. Nothing flashy, no heroic weapons, just simple things used with precise hands. The legend would someday talk about thunder and steel, but the truth was patient wood and careful knots. They planned for noise the way sailors plan for waves. A dog might bark, a tile might crack, a guard might laugh at the wrong time. So they built a net of signals. A soft tap meant hold, a double tap meant advance, a drawn-out whistle meant change route. If everything went perfectly, no one would notice them at all. But life rarely plays along, so the backup plans had their own backup plans. Paths like branches, each one leading to the same winter route. Letters were written and never sent. Some men drafted farewells to wives, apologies to children, thanks to parents who taught them to bow and to stand. A few slipped coins into hidden jars for families to find later. They didn't speak of death, there was no need. Every small kindness, repairing a neighbor's fence, sharing extra rice, sweeping a street corner, felt like arranging the world so it would miss them a little less. Quiet courage looks a lot like good manners. Doubt visited at odd hours. It came as a dream where the gate wouldn't open, or as a memory of Asano's calm face in lamplight. It came as a child's question, "When will you be home?" and as the sound of temple bells at dawn. Oshi listened more than he spoke. He answered doubts with steadiness. Tea poured evenly, instructions given softly, the map rolled and unrolled until fear had nothing new to say. Leadership isn't thunder, it's a hand that stays level when the road tilts. Kira's vigilance thinned like old paper. The spies still watched, but their reports grew boring. The drunk in Kyoto had sobered and vanished. The Arco men were scattered nobodies. Guards yawned at midnight. A gate, once double-checked, was merely glanced at. Fear is expensive. People stop paying it when they think the bill is past due. The Rōnin didn't celebrate. They just nodded and kept sanding the rough edges off their plan. Silence was still their best armor. At last the year's circle closed. The city lay tucked beneath a quiet snowfall, the moon a pale coin over Edo's rooftops. In a small house, 47 men knelt, each one steady as a lantern on a windless night. No speeches, no grand promises, just a final glance at the map, the soft rasp of steel, and the common understanding that loyalty had carried them here, and would carry them the rest of the way. The waiting was over, the night had arrived. The night was cold, wrapped in a silence only winter knows. Snow lay thick on Edo's rooftops, softening the edges of the city. Lanterns flickered faintly on quiet streets, their glow dimmed by the storm's hush. It was the perfect night. Quiet, crisp and still. For 2 long years the Rōnin had waited, pretending to be broken men. Tonight they became warriors again. Tonight 47 shadows moved as one, carrying their master's honor into the heart of Edo. They wore dark robes, sandals bound tight with cloth to muffle sound, and straw hats dusted white by falling flakes. Each man carried more than a sword. He carried years of patience, shame, and unspoken vows. They split into 2 groups, one at the front of Kira's mansion, the other at the back. The signal was simple. When the drumbeat sounded, both sides would move at once, trapping their enemy within. The snow fell thicker, but none of them shivered. Their fire burned hotter than winter's bite. Watchmen dozed at the front gate. Lulled by the snow's stillness, the Rōnin crept close, ladders sliding into place, ropes looped quietly over beams. Not a word was spoken, only the hiss of snow under sandals. Then, boom, the drumbeat shattered the silence, echoing through the street. In an instant, ladders lifted, doors were wedged, and the attack began. For the first time in 2 years, the Rōnin unsheathed their swords in earnest. The guards rushed out, half asleep, blades flashing in the lantern light. But the Rōnin were ready. They moved with the precision of men who had rehearsed every step. Wooden gates slammed shut behind them, cutting off escape. Arrows hissed into the snow, and swords clashed with the ring of steel. Inside the mansion, lamps flared as servants screamed and scattered. The quiet night had exploded into fury. One group pressed forward through the main gate, while the other poured in from the rear. The mansion, once a place of luxury, became a battlefield. Walls shook with the sound of blades, floors stained with snow and blood. But the Rōnin didn't fight recklessly. Every movement was deliberate. They weren't raiders, they weren't thieves, they were loyal samurai fulfilling a duty. That sense of purpose carried them through the storm of steel. Some peeked through shutters, expecting thieves or drunken brawlers. Instead, they saw order in the storm, disciplined men striking with precision, leaving servants unharmed, aiming only at guards. A few townsfolk even whispered, "It's the Arko men, they've come at last." The legend of loyalty was being written before their eyes, each stroke of the sword another line in history. The Rōnin fought through chamber after chamber, searching for their target. They called out to each other with quiet signals, moving like water through the mansion's halls. In one room, a Rōnin smashed through sliding doors with the flat of his blade. In another, a guard's cry was cut short by steel. Yet amid the violence, their discipline held. They did not harm women or children, nor loot treasures. Their focus was singular, Kira Yoshinaka. The noise grew louder as drums and whistles filled the night. Snow melted on hot blades, dripping red and white into the floors. But still, Kira did not appear. His men defended fiercely, buying time, perhaps hoping their master could escape. Yet the Rōnin pressed on, certain that Kira was still inside. Each passing moment only steeled their resolve. They had not waited 2 years to fail now. As the fighting raged, Oshi stood at the center, calm as he had been in every secret meeting. He gave no fiery speeches, no dramatic gestures, only steady orders, spoken low and clear. His men moved with the trust of brothers, following his voice through the storm. This was the night his humiliation in Kyoto had purchased. Every insult endured, every drunken stumble, had led here to the heart of vengeance. The hour grew late, the snow piled higher, and the sound of steel still echoed in the dark. Kira's guards fell one by one, the mansion's defenses collapsing. The Rōnin were close now, they could feel it. Somewhere in these halls their enemy hid, trembling behind wooden walls. The long wait was nearly over. The night of the attack would soon become the night of reckoning. Inside Kira's mansion, panic spread like fire through dry grass. Guards shouted, servants screamed, doors slammed open and shut. The Rōnin pushed deeper, their sandals crunching snow dragged in from the courtyards. 2 years of silence had turned into thunder. But unlike wild raiders, they were disciplined. They struck swiftly, moved methodically, and left no confusion about their purpose. They weren't here for plunder, they were here for one man, Kira Yoshinaka. The first line of defense collapsed quickly. Guards scrambled half-armored, swords hastily unsheathed, trying to meet the sudden storm. But the Rōnin had numbers and resolve. They fought not for coin or orders, but for honor. Each clash was quick, steel on steel, a cry, then silence. The halls filled with smoke from toppled lamps, shadows dancing on paper walls as the Rōnin pressed forward. At the rear gate, a smaller group of Rōnin scaled ladders, cutting down guards who tried to escape. A few sentries ran toward the neighboring houses, shouting warnings, but townsfolk stayed hidden behind shutters. Edo knew better than to interfere. Tonight belonged to the men of Akko, and everyone watching in silence knew they were witnessing history. The Rōnin moved room to room, searching. They spared women, children, and servants, steering them aside rather than striking. Their vengeance wasn't blind, it was focused. They called out Kira's name, demanding he face them. But the mansion was a maze of chambers, storehouses, and gardens. Somewhere in the dark, their quarry hid. The hunt was as much about patience as swordplay. The sound of drums and whistles guided the men. Oshi had planned for order in the storm. Signals carried through the halls like breadcrumbs. 1 whistle meant regroup, 2 meant push forward. A drum beat meant a breach. Even amid fire and blood, their movements felt like a single body, each man a hand, each sword a finger. The mansion wasn't falling to chaos, it was falling to precision. In one wing, guards tried to form a barricade of furniture, shoving chests and tables across the corridor. The Rōnin didn't hesitate. They smashed through sliding screens, burst from side doors, and cut the defense in 2. The barricade toppled like a child's game. A handful of desperate men stood their ground, but discipline and numbers overcame them. Soon the path was clear again. Snow blew in through broken shutters, mixing with smoke and blood on the polished wooden floors. The Rōnin pressed on, the cold wind stinging their faces, the clash of steel echoing down the halls. Yet even in the chaos, their restraint was clear. They were not here to slaughter, only to strike balance. The mansion itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable moment when hunter and prey would meet. Kira's men grew desperate. Some fled deeper into the estate, others tried to fight on the staircases, shouting in terror as they clashed with disciplined steel. But the tide had already turned. Each skirmish ended quickly, the Rōnin moving forward like a tide that could not be held back. Servants prayed quietly in corners, too afraid to move. The mansion that had once been a symbol of Kira's power was now his prison. Oishi himself directed the assault calmly, his voice carrying through the storm. He checked every chamber, asked every servant where Kira was hiding, and pressed the search with relentless patience. He wasn't reckless, he knew that the moment would come only once. Kira was somewhere inside, and nothing else mattered until he was found. By midnight the guards had been cut down, the mansion torn open, its walls echoing with silence again. But the Rōnin had not yet found their target. Somewhere in the estate, Kira Yoshinaka cowered, hidden from the storm he had brought upon himself. The assault had broken his defenses, now the hunt for the man himself would begin. The mansion had gone strangely quiet. Only the wind spoke now, teasing torn paper screens and sifting snow through broken shutters. The Rōnin stood amid the hush, breath steady, blades lowered. They had crossed courtyards and corridors, climbed stairs and cut through barricades. Guards were down, doors were open. But the man who had started all this, the man whose insults had set a sword singing in Edo Castle, was still missing. The night held its breath, like the beat before a drum. Oishi moved through the halls as if reading a map only he could see. He questioned servants gently, asked where the storerooms were, where small doors led, how the gardens connected behind the walls. This wasn't a chase of fury, it was a hunt of patience. He is in the house, Oishi said softly. He has not escaped. And the men of Arko spread out again, their footfalls soft as falling ash. One Rōnin found a door that didn't feel right, too narrow for a proper room, too quiet for a place people used. Behind it the air smelled of damp wood and ash, the sour scent of extinguished charcoal. The men exchanged a glance. A storage shed, or a hiding place. They eased the door aside, the track whispering, and held the lantern forward. The light slid over brooms and buckets, a heap of kindling, and a crouched figure in plain clothes, hands shaking, face turned away. The man would not speak. He kept his head down, as if shrinking into his robe could erase him from the world. "Name yourself," a Rōnin said, voice even. "Nothing." Another lifted the lantern higher. A pale cheek, a scarred line beneath the eye, the mark left by Asano's blade months before. The room seemed to tilt, as if the house itself recognized the moment. This then was Kira Yoshinaka, not the golden official of ceremony, but a shivering man in a storage shed. They brought him out carefully, not like a trophy, but like a truth. In a small room near the garden, Oishi faced him. "If you are Kira Yoshinaka," he said, calm as winter light, "take your blade and die like a samurai. Meet your end with dignity." It was not taunt but ritual, an invitation to choose honor in the last passage. Hands trembled, eyes flicked to the floor. No answer came. The silence stretched. Outside, snow tapped gently at the eaves. The men waited, as samurai should. A long breath. Another. Kira's shoulders sagged. Fear had fastened itself to him like iron. He would not take the blade. In another age, another story, a different ending might have been written. But this was the night forged by 2 years of patience and a single moment in a castle corridor. If Kira would not meet honor, honor would meet him. Oishi nodded once. The room, and the world, moved forward. They had brought with them a small blade that mattered more than its length. Lord Asano's dagger, kept since the day of his death. Steel is just steel until meaning is bound to it. In Oshi's hands it was the thread that tied insult to answer, sentence to fulfillment. A designated Rōnin stepped forward. The stroke must be clean, the moment exact. The lantern flame tightened to a bright bead, and even the snow seemed to pause in the air. No shouts, no flourish, just a single impeccable motion, the kind drilled 1,000 times and reserved for a single night. The lantern flickered once and steadied. Breath left the room like mist. The deed was done not as rage but as balance, the completing half of a broken circle. In the quiet that followed, the Rōnin did what warriors do when the storm passes. They made things proper. They washed the head carefully, as custom demanded, and wrapped it in clean cloth. Incense was lit, the air filled with a thin line of fragrance that climbed toward the rafters and vanished into dark. No cheering, no gloating, only the small sounds of ritual, the pour of water, the fold of cloth, the soft click of a lid. In that quiet work, the night felt less like victory and more like a vow kept to the very last line. When they stepped back into the courtyard, dawn was still far away, but the snow made its own kind of mourning. The head, wrapped and sealed, would be carried to Sengaku-ji, to Lord Asano's grave, where incense and prayers would bind deed to memory. The Rōnin gathered their wounded, set the fallen aside with care, and closed the doors they had broken. Somewhere in the city, a temple bell sounded a distant hour. In the white hush, honor felt heavy and light at once, like a burden you are grateful to carry. The hunt was over, the legend had taken its final shape. When the fighting was finished, the mansion stood broken and silent. Snow drifted through holes in the roof. smoke curled from shattered lamps, and the echoes of steel were replaced by the hush of winter. The Rōnin gathered in the courtyard, swords still in hand, but their purpose complete. They had waited 2 years for this single night, and now Kira Yoshinaka was gone. What remained was not celebration, but duty. Oishi gave calm orders. The dead guards were laid respectfully aside, the wounded tended as best they could. Even in vengeance, discipline remained. They had not come to ravage or boast, they had come to restore balance. The servants, spared and unharmed, watched in silence. For them, this night was both terrifying and strangely reverent, as though they were witnessing a ritual older than memory itself. From the quiet room where it had been wrapped, the head of Kira was brought forth. It was not paraded or displayed, but carried with care. The Rōnin gathered around it, bowing deeply. For them, this was no trophy. It was proof that their oath had been fulfilled, that their master's honor had been answered. In silence, they lifted it, and prepared for the journey to Sengaku-ji, where Lord Asano's grave awaited. The 47 formed a line, moving through the snow with the steady pace of men carrying something far heavier than weapons. Townsfolk stirred from their shutters, eyes wide. Whispers spread from door to door. The Arco men have struck. Kira is dead. Some gasped in shock, others murmured in awe. The legend was no longer rumor, it was alive, walking through the snow toward a temple. When they reached Sengaku-ji, the temple stood quiet, its gates heavy with snow. Inside lay the grave of Lord Asano. The Rōnin knelt before it, placing Kira's head on the stone, offering incense and prayers. For a moment the world seemed to fold in on itself, master and retainers together again, honor restored. The temple bells rang, carrying the sound into the cold air as if marking the completion of something greater than vengeance, a balance set right. But their duty did not end at the grave. Once prayers were finished, Oipi gathered his men and led them back into the city. They knew what must come next. The law of the shogunate was clear. Their attack had been illegal, no matter how righteous it felt. The Rōnin would not flee or hide. They had avenged their master, now they would surrender and accept whatever fate awaited them. When they arrived at the authorities, they presented themselves with calm dignity. No excuses, no pleas. Oipi spoke plainly. "We have carried out justice for our lord. We place ourselves in your hands." The officials were stunned. Edo buzzed with the story. 47 men who had defied fear, waited in silence, and now offered their own lives without resistance. To the people, they were heroes. To the law, they were criminals. The shogun was informed. The court debated fiercely. Should the men be executed as traitors, or honored as models of loyalty? Punish them, and the people would mourn martyrs. Spare them, and the law would appear weak. The Rōnin themselves waited quietly, as they had always done, ready for whatever decision came. Their patience had not ended with vengeance, it carried into surrender. For the people of Edo, the story was already legend. Lanterns in the streets glowed brighter, storytellers whispered of the 47 who had turned disgrace into honor. Merchants, peasants, even other samurai found themselves speaking of them with respect. Whether the law saw them as criminals or not, the people saw them as men who had proved loyalty could outlast death. And so the Rōnin waited, not with fear, but with the calm of men who had already fulfilled their purpose. Their swords were sheathed, their voices quiet, their duty complete. Whatever came next, history had already claimed them. They had walked through snow into legend, and now they sat patiently at its edge, waiting for the final chapter to be written. The Rōnin sat quietly in confinement, waiting for judgment. They had already accepted death before they ever drew their swords, so the silence now was almost peaceful. Outside, Edo buzzed with their story, merchants whispering at stalls, children repeating their names like heroes from old plays. The shogun's council wrestled with the decision. Were these men criminals who had broken the law, or paragons of loyalty who had upheld the highest ideals of Bushidō? In the end, the shogunate reached a decision that reflected the paradox of their actions. The 47 would be sentenced to death, but they would die as samurai, not criminals. They were ordered to commit seppuku, the same ritual their lord had endured. It was both punishment and honor, a way to uphold the law while still recognizing their loyalty. To many, this was the only decision that made sense. When the Rōnin heard the sentence, they bowed deeply. There were no protests, no cries for mercy. Their leader Oishi thanked the officials for allowing them to die with honor. Imagine that gratitude, not fear, in the face of death. But this was the samurai way. Life had already been given to loyalty. Now death was simply the last payment on that vow. On the day appointed, the Rōnin dressed in white robes, the color of purity. They bathed, wrote final poems, and shared quiet moments with each other. No dramatics, no wailing, just steady preparation. They had waited years for this end, and they would meet it as samurai should, calm, disciplined, loyal to the very last breath. The ritual began. One by one, each man knelt before the short sword, composed his final thoughts, and carried out the ceremony. Beside each sat a second, ready to strike swiftly and end the suffering. The chambers were filled not with cries but with silence and incense, as if the world itself bowed in respect. 47 times the ritual was completed, and 47 times the vow was sealed. When it was over, the people of Edo mourned and honored them. Their bodies were taken to Sengaku-ji Temple, laid to rest beside Lord Asano. Pilgrims came to light incense, bow, and whisper prayers. Farmers, merchants, samurai, all saw in them a reflection of the highest loyalty. They had broken the shogunate's law, but in the hearts of the people, they had fulfilled something greater, the law of honor. Their story spread beyond Edo, retold in plays and poems. Kabuki theaters dramatized the snowy night, turning the assault into spectacle. Woodblock prints carried their images into every corner of Japan. Over time, the details blurred, but the essence remained: 47 men who chose loyalty over life, patience over pride, silence over safety. The legend grew until it was no longer just history, but a mirror of what the samurai spirit meant. Even centuries later, their graves still draw visitors. Pilgrims and tourists alike come to Sengaku-ji, laying incense and flowers, whispering thanks to men long gone. The smell of smoke drifts over snow, the stone markers worn smooth by time. Yet the loyalty they represent feels alive, as if the 47 are still kneeling there, swords at their sides, waiting patiently in the quiet dawn. It is both tragedy and triumph, law and rebellion, death and honor. Some see them as reckless men who broke the peace. Others see them as the purest example of samurai loyalty. Perhaps both are true. History rarely offers easy answers. What matters is that their choice to endure disgrace, to wait, to strike, and then to surrender, still resonates as one of the most powerful stories of duty ever told. And so we end where they ended. 47 men, kneeling in white snow, remembered not for what they gained but for what they gave up. Their master's honor became their own, and their sacrifice became Japan's legend. In the hush of night, when snow drifts against wooden gates and lanterns glow faintly through paper screens, the story of the 47 still whispers. Loyalty is stronger than death, and patience is sharper than steel.